We've got a two-person panel first up here. Jon Gaska is a senior research agronomist in the Soybean Research Program at the University of Wisconsin and is going to present some of their research looking at winter rye cover with soybeans. And then Sam Bennett, a farmer from Northwest Iowa, is going to talk about his experience. He's also done some on-farm research, and these guys are going to talk a little bit about impact on insects and weeds. So Jon, we'll start with you. And if you have questions, we'll be coming around with that microphone. We're streaming this, and so if you speak into the microphone for your questions, our folks listening online can also hear your question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Margaret. I'm Jon Gaska. I hail from near Madison, Wisconsin, and I work at the University of Wisconsin in the agronomy department, and our research project is focused on soybeans and small grain production for Wisconsin farmers. We conduct the Wisconsin Soybean Variety Evaluation Program at 10 locations around Wisconsin. And we also do the same for winter wheat as well, soft red winter wheat. We have 4 locations that we do the variety testing as well. And then we also do a lot of management practice research on both soybeans and small grains in Wisconsin. And what I'm going to talk about today is some of our work on cover crops in soybeans. And we are part of a regional project. They're looking at actually the focus of the cover crop research we did in soybeans was actually focused more on insects, but I think we have yield data and such, and as well as insect data to share with you today. I did several presentations on cover crops to Wisconsin farmers, and I tried to gauge their level of comfort and how much they've used cover crops. And the N on this is pretty small. There's not a lot of responses here, but when I asked the question of have I tried planting green, or I love planting green, I have mixed results with planting green, or I want to learn about planting green, or I only do it for corn, I was pretty happy to see that number of people wanted to at least learn about planting green and learning about planting soybeans into cover crops. And a number of people have mixed results with planting green too, which I usually expect. The other question I asked is, when do you terminate your cover crop if you're planting soybeans? And majority of people are doing it early. They're doing it with their burn down herbicide, or they're doing it 1 to 2 weeks before planting. And what we want to try and maybe move the needle a little bit on this is to look at terminating later, leaving that cover crop going a little bit longer, and maybe terminated planting or even after planting. And that some of the data that I'll show you today is just that. It's just showing the response of soybeans to terminating just a little bit later. I probably don't have to elaborate too much on this, but on cover crops, usage has increased by 50% from 2012 to 2017, and it's really become a standard practice for a lot of growers in the Midwest. We're still we've got a number of good grower groups in Wisconsin that are really promoting cover crops, and we're starting to get a lot of take on it in Wisconsin, and so I'm pretty excited about that. Obviously, there's a lot of good reasons to use cover crops for weed suppression. If we use rye, the fibrous root system supports equipment going across the field. The soil erosion, soil health benefits and such, I'm sure many of you know about those. And that last question is really the focus of the research that we did for 3 years. It's just what does it do on arthropods? Are they a hindrance or a benefit for cover crops? For termination options in In cover crops, we, on our project that I'll describe in a little bit, we used a herbicide termination, but I realized that there's a lot of other ways to do it. The organic folks are using a roller crimper at anthesis. That pretty much is a standard. However, we do have a strong organic research program at Madison as well, and they are looking into other timings of termination of the cover crops. As a soybean agronomist, I see a problem with terminating a cover crop late and then planting soybeans late. We really, to maximize soybean yields, we really need to get those soybeans in early. And again, the traditional kind of organic system where you're waiting till anthesis to roller crimp and then plant the soybeans in Wisconsin, that means the last week of May, beginning of June. And that is, in our research, a month late to be planting soybeans. And so some of the research that we're doing and the organic component of the agronomy department and plant pathology department at UW-Madison is trying to push that planting a little bit earlier and find different ways to terminate that rye. In an organic system, it has to be mechanically, obviously, but trying to get that soybean planted earlier. And that's, in my mind, is really a key to improving soybean yields in a cover crop system. So we want to get that soybean planted early, but we still need to get that cover crop terminated. The particular project I can talk about today is a multi-state project. It's funded by the Soybean Checkoff and through the North Central program. And it's to evaluate the effect of rye termination timing. So we're looking at, basically our main treatment is when are we going to terminate the rye. And we want to know how that's going to affect the arthropods in a cover crop system. Arthropods, again, are exoskeleton insects that have jointed legs. That's the population of, I'm not going to call them pests because there are beneficial arthropods too, but those arthropods, they can include insects, they can include centipedes and millipedes are also in the arthropod family, spiders as well, and crustaceans if you get into aquatic kind of things too, crabs and lobsters and such are arthropods as well. But we're looking at those arthropods in this cover crop trial. You can see the states that were involved in this particular project. They're in the Midwest and Ohio to the east. And I'll describe the treatments in a little bit here, what we did. We can look at arthropods as a pest. And if we look across the calendar year, kind of, starting from a year, starting from the fall or winter and going through the winter and into the spring, you can see that those arthropods, those pests, populations are increasing when it gets warm. Obviously, their warm insects population will increase. However, if we cross out that word pest and put beneficial arthropods too, we have those out there too. So we're not out to kill all the arthropods, all the insects in our systems. We need the beneficials as well in there too. And their populations also increase in spring as well. So trying to shift that thinking from these insects are a problem in my cover crop system to thinking about, hey, there's beneficial insects too out there that can help the system as well. And so we don't want to just assume that they're all going to be a negative to the project. Our particular study that we did with those other states, and we just had one location in Wisconsin. It involved several different treatments, and we established rye in the fall, about 60 pounds of rye per acre. We did it in land that was used for corn silage. We've got over 1 million acres of corn silage in Wisconsin, and it's pretty common to be planting rye after corn silage. So we chose the fields for 3 years that were in corn silage, and established that rye in the fall. And then the main treatments in this study are, when are we going to terminate the rye? So we started with an early termination, like 14 days before we planted. Typically that was in Wisconsin, that's around the 25th of April. At planting termination, we're trying to get our beans in Wisconsin early May, so May 1 to 8th or something, 7 days after termination, and that would be mid-May. And then we added another treatment just in Wisconsin at 14 days after planting. So terminating the rye, again, we're terminating it with glyphosate. We're not using a roller crimper or anything like that. And so those were the treatments in this trial in Wisconsin and in a number of different states, but we only had one location in Wisconsin. The trials are laid out in 30-foot by 60-foot plots. I will be giving you the university view of this kind of research, and then when Sam comes up, he'll give you the farmer view of this too. Bigger, larger plots, but we use smaller plots, all statistically valid, randomized complete plot designs, and replicated as well. Example of some of the size of the plots. The one in the background was terminated 14 days before planting, and then the one in the foreground at planting termination. You can see approximate the size of the research plots that we used for this particular project. So to look at kind of the treatments and such over the calendar year, again, we're planting that cover crop in late September. We're doing our different termination timings in late April and through May. Again, the treatments again are 14 days before planting, at planting, 7 days after planting, and 14 days after planting. We also included a no rye plot in there as well, so one that didn't have any rye on it. We collected grain yield, of course, from the soybean, and we also collected biomass and plant height as well. And I know that Sam has forage data as well to share with you from his farm there. So our biomass collection was just done with small little grids. We clipped the rye and dried it and weighed it. And from each plot, we would do 3 or 4 of these squares to get a good average. As far as the insect part, how do we do that? Well, we use what's called a pitfall trap. Pitfall traps are a small hole that we dig in the ground. We put a cup in there. We fill the cup with antifreeze, maybe half to 3/4 full, and then we leave those out for 5 days. And so the edge of the cup is right at ground level. And any insects, especially the ground insects, are going to fall into there, and then we take them up and we count them. And we had a summer intern that was interested in entomology take these cups and then with a microscope or a scope of some sort to try to identify these insects. And the pitfall traps that we use, we put out when the soybeans were about V2 to V3 growth stage, so talking 5-6 inches tall. They're placed in the center of the plot and then collected after 5 days. And so that's how we kind of quantified our arthropod and our insect populations in this study. You can see a closer view of that cup and that antifreeze in there, and then a little plate over the top just to protect it from rain. But those were again left out for 5 days, and then they collected all the ground insects that were on that. The planter that we used for these trials is a research plot planter that I built. We use it for a number of different purposes, but it can plant 15-inch rows or it can plant 30-inch rows, and I had it set for 30-inch rows. And you can see the tractor going through the different plots with the different treatments. One piece of equipment that I used on my planter is the Sabretooth planter disc openers. They're furnished by Precision Tillage Technology, and the opening disc blades have teeth in them, and the two blades are at a V shape, and the teeth intersect in the front. And I had really good luck with these. Going through the plots. We use them actually on all of our research plots, and we do a lot of no-till work. But those planter disc opener blades were really, really good, and I used them 1 year just to try them out, and then we just kept them on the planter. So those are a good way to cut through residue, whether it just be no-till residue or corn stalks or the rye. I play with different tillage attachments on the planter. I do something different every year, it seems. In 2021, I decided to I had row cleaners on there. I decided to take those off and just go through with a blade, a coulter blade. So these are John Deere XP row units, and they're heavy. They're cast iron. We have down pressure on there, and I just attached a single fluted no-till coulter in front of the row unit, and to me that worked very well. In 2020, I had row cleaners on here, and I decided to take them off and just try it without it, and we had no trouble getting through the residue and getting a good seed-to-soil contact with that planter. On the back of the planter, we use drag chains, and in this particular case, the row on the left and the row on the right are in the ground. The middle one is raised, and it's not engaged in the ground. I've also been known to try many different kinds of closing wheels as well. So you can see the row unit on the left has a finger tooth kind of a row closing option. The one on the right is using a tooth and a rubber, the original John Deere rubber wheel there. So each one works differently, different soil conditions and such. My recommendation, if you're ever interested in trying something new, is to don't outfit your 16-row planter with all the same row unit or accessory 1 year. Try it on a couple different rows to make sure it works okay. But we had pretty good luck with both of these kind of systems here, getting through the residue. And you'll see here the row planted no-till soil is nice to work with, nice friable soil. Really nice seed-to-soil contact in there, and getting right down between the rows of the standing rye. So we had no trouble establishing our soybeans in these particular trials. So the part that you're probably waiting for, just to see what the yields are from all these trials. Again, we did it in 2019, 20, and 2021. So all the same treatments, except 20 and 21, we added a later termination timing of 14 days after planting. So the letters, I don't know if you can see the letters, but there's letters that are similar in the bars indicate that those two treatments are not statistically different. The highest overall yields were in 2020, and this kind of graph is what we're seeing is typical of some of our no-till work, some of our cover crop work. It's variable year to year a little bit. We had quite dry conditions like a lot of people in 2021, and I'm afraid we might have lost a lot of cover croppers from the 2021 year just because it was dry. We saw the rye take a lot of moisture out of the ground and leave the ground pretty dry for whatever crop was growing in there. And so you see the fluctuation in the yields here. In 2019, our highest yields were from 14 days before planting termination and also at planting termination. In 2020, the highest yields came from, again, the 14 days before planting termination and also at the 14 days after planting termination. And then in 2021, last year, again, the 14 days before planting termination and the 7 days after. So a little bit of a mixture there of results, nothing standing out really strong for the people who don't want to do any cover crops. I say this data shows that the using cover crops is not detrimental to soybean yields. And we have plenty of cover crop haters in Wisconsin that just won't do it. And they're afraid it'll take away the yields, and our data doesn't show that. On the other hand, we're trying to push that envelope of getting the soybeans in and keeping some cover over the ground for weed control and erosion control as long as we can. And so those later treatments are the ones that we're interested in looking at. If we take all 3 years and put them together here, the bars with the A were the highest yields. The bars with the B are significantly different in yield than the ones with the A. So our no rye treatment, we're at 68 bushels per acre. When we did 14 days before planting termination, about 71. At planting, at 68. And when we terminated 7 days after planting, about 68, 69. And then 14 days after planting termination, we're about 68 or 67 or 68 there. So to me, not a good reason right there not to use cover crops. Certainly not going to hurt yields very much. You have to obviously look at the benefits of the cover crops as well too. But I think that there's still hope, and that we can, get some of these terminations a little later and not having to come early. The standard thought from the farmers that I work with, they want to get that rye out of the way as soon as possible in spring. And we're trying to say, hey, maybe you don't have to do it so early. We look at cover crop height and biomass. These are kind of no-brainers. When we terminate early at planting and late, we've obviously got taller rye on the late terminations, and the same with the biomass too. That's in kilograms per hectare on the left, but the early is probably about 900. We got about 900 pounds per acre of dry matter. At planting, which is May 5th or so, we're probably about 2,000 pounds of dry matter per acre. And then when we do that late termination, which is 7 to 14 days after planting, we're probably about 3,800 pounds of dry matter per acre. So if you're wanting to use it as a forage or something, there's possibilities there too. Insect defoliation, we're going to look at the arthropods here. Basically, there was no statistical difference in any of the arthropod activities between the treatments. We have the no rye there early at planting and late. This one shows the ground beetles, sap beetles, and spiders, and basically no statistical difference in any of those. So we had insects in the no rye treatment as well. A slight numerical increase in sap beetles at plant termination. Sap beetles are your standard picnic beetle that shows up at your picnics. And then there was arthropod activity in all the treatments, though, no matter which one there was. We looked at defoliation. None of our plots reached a 30% threshold in any of those 3 years. We use the Pitfall Traps to trap millipedes as well, and there's some data from Nebraska there too, but the Wisconsin data is on the far right. And treatment one, the termination 14 days before planting, that had the highest amount of millipedes, but again, we don't really consider those a real viable pest for soybeans in Wisconsin. But I do get a lot of questions on slugs. And slugs are not arthropods, they're mollusks. And many farmers believe that the cover crops are part of the problem of slugs. And I'm here to say, not as an entomologist, but an agronomist, that cover crops can actually be helpful in the fight against slugs. They do diversify the rotations. Slugs prefer the the dying cover crop, like cereal rye, over the cash crop. And if we think about biodiversity, we're fostering improved natural enemy populations, particularly ground beetles, help suppress slug populations. So it's all a balance of these insects in the ecosystem, and natural enemy populations will be suppressed by insecticides. So we don't want to be using those if we want to try and keep some of the beneficials around. So we do get a lot of slug questions in Wisconsin, but I don't believe they're a real big problem in cover crops. Conclusions on the arthropod part of it: pest pressure was low over all the states, locations and years. The arthropod response was variable between location and year. Basically, we did this in 3 years and in 6 different states, and we really had low pest pressure in all those locations. The conclusions that we reached, I guess, on basically just on general cover crops. Cover crops may not increase soybean yields, but they're certainly not detrimental to soybean yields. We're going to allow as much biomass to accumulate as possible for weed control, and we found that a burn down of glyphosate was plenty to control any of or to terminate any of the cover crops that we grew. Wisconsin does have a strong program for nutrient pest management, and also the organic and sustainable agricultural research and extension. We have good programs at Plug in Wisconsin right now, but we do have a lot of resources for growers to use if they want to use cover crops in their organic or conventional systems. And then I'll just finish up with a couple slides here of this was in 2021. This year, this is what we had a lot of rye growth early on. And so 7 days after planting, this has not taken 7 days after planting, but it's later in the season, but that's what the rye cover looked like on that when we terminated. And it was even worse. That was how tall the rye was when we terminated 14 days after planting. So we were planting through some pretty thick rye that already started to head out, and it was a tough environment there. We tried some mowing treatments. I don't have any data on this, but looking at mowing that later termination timing. We tried some mowing. The bush hog that I used had a lot of wheels on it, and so we ran over a lot of beans with that. So I don't know. We're gonna keep looking at other termination options there. Crimping, we tried a little bit of crimping. Again, that's been pretty useful for organic farmers. And then we did have some mallard ducks lay their eggs in our cover crop field, and so that was pretty cool to see that. So, and that's it. So, do you want me to take questions now, or do you want Sam? Is there any questions on our research? Yes, sir.
Any ideas on the at planting termination, why it seems like that always has at least a small dip in yield?
Yep, I noticed that too, and I'm not sure why. We would have sprayed the same day that we planted, and I don't know why that was, but yeah, we did see that little dip there, and I'm not sure even to speculate on why it might have that.
One other question, you mentioned about slugs. You're talking about damage to the growing crop. What about damage then to, if you come back in and replant, say broadcast rye or something like that into those beans? Are you running into any slug damage to the rye seed?
To the rye seed, we didn't see any in this particular study. If you're possibly spreading, aerial spreading or something, you might see that. But put it in the ground, we didn't have any damage. And actually, I put the slug picture out. We didn't actually have any slug damage in these plots as well. But again, as I said, we get a lot of questions on slugs in other crops. But I was trying to show that they're in cover crop systems. What the entomologists will tell you is that they're not all terrible bad. You know, there's some positives to them too.
So I'd like to just ask you your question about this type of system in a drought year. So do you think it's because of lack of moisture, or is it just a hard soil surface, when after you terminate your rye? Because this year I planted some rye in Ames, Iowa. We had a drought year, and I'd have thought that it conserved more moisture, and there was more moisture for the crop there. But I found that it was just a hard soil all year. So what is it? Is it hard soil, or is it lack of moisture that creates that yield drag in a drought year?
Yeah. Well, in all of our trials, and like any farmers, we plant, we go back and see how the seed's germinating and stuff. When I dug up these seeds and dug up the furrows where the seeds were in the rye, it was very dry. I mean, the soil was just very dry. And it wasn't a hard, we were able to, with the planter scenario, the planter setup, we were able to break the crust and get through. But I'm going to attribute it to the moisture rather than the hard soil. So it just was very dry. Yeah.
We had infestation of fall armyworms in this area, and I know you're not an entomologist. Just curious if you had any anecdotal remarks to make about interactions between cover crops and fall armyworm.
Yep. I did actually talk to our resident entomologist in Wisconsin about this, and he said he's been there 35 years, and he said there was a once in a career amount of fall armyworms there. So, and they ate lawns, they ate a lot of things in Wisconsin, but establishing. So in this system, we're establishing the rye in late September, and then it emerged. We did not see, at least in our plots, and I didn't hear any anecdotal information about the armyworms hurting the rye, the establishment in the fall. And in fact, in Wisconsin, in a normal year, rye I was just talking to Margaret at lunchtime, that some of that stuff is established in late October and early November, and then obviously there's no insectage. But I would say most of the rye in Wisconsin is established later to miss any of that.
I'm going to take one more question here, John, and then after Sam speaks, I'd like to bring you both up and kind of do a round-robin question for both of you.
Okay.
Do you see any difference in the termination of the rye with the cooler April spraying versus the later warmer spraying?
No, they were both very effective. The glyphosate did the same this year. I imagine if it was really cold early and we sprayed early and it stayed cold, we might see some maybe a little bit less effectiveness of the glyphosate, but no, they were all dead. So it terminated everything. Oops. Oh, sorry, I missed that. It was a 22 fluid ounces per acre, so standard kind of rate. Yep. All right.
Great.
Yep. Good.
Let's switch over here. Sam Bennett farms in northwest Iowa. And he's going to tell you how many years he's been at this cover crop thing. I don't need to tell you that. So he's going to bring a very practical approach. And in addition to just farmer experience, he's also done some large-scale plots, and he's going to share some of those numbers as well. Thanks, Sam.
All right. Thank you, Margaret.
You have to advance here. We don't have
Okay. That's fine. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you today. What a nice day for a winter meeting. I'm Sam Bennett. I live in Northwest Iowa. I farm there with my dad and my brother. We farm about 2,000 acres. We're kind of rolling hills, not that much different than right here, but we farm conventionally and organically. And I guess when I say conventionally is GMO crops and organic crops. We integrate small grains, cover crops into our corn and soybean system. I've been farming for 8 years with land in my name, but I grew up on the farm. I've been involved with the farm forever. My dad started doing some cover crops in 2008 and was kind of a early adopter of cover crops in the area from there, and he's pretty much retired now, but I'm picking up some of that with some of my own ideas. And I've been doing some on-farm research with Practical Farmers of Iowa since 2018. So I'm going to talk mostly about that today. And I guess that's right where I live, that red star. I'm on Highway 20, 50 miles east of Sioux City. So we're some of that similar ground that's like that really good ground in northwest Iowa, but in a pretty good spot, but enough rolling hills where we drain fairly well. I need to plug Practical Farmers of Iowa. Practical Farmers of Iowa has a cooperatives program that does on-farm research. It's all farmer-led. We come up with ideas. PFI staff supports our ideas and publishes it in a really, really meaningful way. And all of that information is available on PFI's website. All the research reports are put together in forms that farmers can understand, and it's not just all scientific, statistical stuff that I generally don't understand. It's pretty farmer-to-farmer stuff. So if you're interested in that, certainly talk to me later. I'm going to talk about mostly using rye cover crops, cereal rye cover crops, to suppress weeds in my system. I've done a lot of trials kind of around that idea. I think there's a lot of benefits to using a rye cover crop before soybeans, but today we're just going to focus pretty much on how they can reduce our weed pressure or help our herbicide programs, or however you want to look at that. I'm going to talk about a trial that I think worked too well, and then I'm going to talk about a trial that didn't work very well, and then I'm going to talk about a trial that I think most guys could understand and adopt and use on their farms, and probably a happy medium between the two. With our cooperatives program, we like to push the envelope and kind of break the system and maybe learn from that, and then backtrack and figure out systems that actually work on the farm. But we like to have fun with some trials that maybe go too far. So this first trial was 2018. I just wanted to see if I could basically pay for my cover crop with reduced herbicides. I have a lot of pictures here. I'm going to skim through a whole bunch of them. If you have questions or want to go back to a slide, just let me know. But that was the main part of this. This was the first year that this particular field had a cover crop, and it was a pretty high weed pressure field. That's why I wanted to try it on this. Going back to Jon's comments about large-scale trials, I figured if I was going to do this trial, I might as well go whole hog. So this was on 80 acres and randomly replicated trial, 4 different treatments. So there's a lot of good data that comes out of university trials, but you still have to understand that they're plots the size of the squares on this floor, or his trials are actually bigger than that. Iowa State does a lot of very, very small trials that maybe get the idea or get the ball rolling on an idea, but a lot of farmers put more value in large-scale trials if they're, the width of a planter by a half mile versus a 2-row by 10-foot plot. So on this trial, we highboy seeded this, I guess. So a Hagee 60-foot boom, drop nozzles, and about 75 pounds an acre. So a fairly high rate, and planted around Labor Day. So there's just some pictures of that. Again, random replicated, but for this trial we did strips with a cover crop and without a cover crop, and our full herbicide program that we had normally been doing. We're in a no-till system for the most part, so we're heavily dependent on pre-emergent herbicides. And then I wanted to see if I could reduce the herbicides I used, figure that rye is going to be part of my pre-program, so reduced cost program, and then I eliminated that pre-herbicide and just did a cover crop burn down and pretty much a no residual program. So that's what it looked like in the fall. That spring, it snowed in April, so that really slowed down cover crop growth, kind of made me wonder if I was going to get enough biomass to actually control some weeds. It stayed really cold. So there it is in April. Like most years, if we harvest corn versus later, the cover crop takes off once it sees some sunlight. So that picture on the right, or on the right side of that, is corn that we harvested earlier than on the left. This wasn't actually part of the trial, but the trial was done on acres that were harvested later, like the left side of that. So if you're thinking cover crop mulch can control weeds, that right side of the picture would do a lot better than the left side. John's graph of who likes to plant green. I like to plant green. It's my favorite way to plant. It makes a highway for that planter. We don't do a lot of special things to our planter other than adding, we just carry water in our fertilizer tanks for extra weight. But that's a pretty typical photo of planting soybeans on our farm. That is a split row planter too. That's 15-inch beans. So it's got front units on the front of that bar. There was the treatments without any rye. Just what it looks like later. There's beans into dead rye that was terminated about knee high. Later in June, those beans are starting to replace the rye as the rye kind of falls back down. But the purpose of the trial, I didn't want to sacrifice my planting date. I wanted better weed control. So across this whole field, I just have a whole bunch of pictures that it was a really, really clean bean field. I had almost too good of weed control, especially considering there's strips through that field that got no pre-emergent herbicide that we rely on. It just got a cover crop termination and a post-application of just Roundup and clethodim for volunteer corn control. And again, at harvest, there's just no weeds in that field for being one of my weedier fields before that. So this was one of my first trials with PFI, made me believe that rye can do real things in the realm of weed control. I later went on to break the system and figured out that it doesn't always work this perfectly, so this is why I'm sharing this one first. But again, from the combine cab, just no weeds out there. So it's kind of hard to learn from a strip trial type program where you have all the strips look too good. You don't have any weeds to show for in the spots where you reduced herbicides by a lot. But in the end, I reduced costs by enough to pay for that cover crop. And there's my soybean yields, so in the high 70s and 80s. They weren't statistically different. So in that case, I reduced herbicides, let the rye do the work. I planted that cover crop with a goal and achieved that goal with that. So on some fields that we don't have high weed pressure, to this day, I still reduce the amount of herbicide or don't rely on the herbicide nearly as much if I know I have a really good rye cover crop. So there's just my programs. If you're interested in those, I can answer those questions later. Let's see, I can talk about this later too. With this a little bit, if you really, really want to maximize rye biomass, again, look at corn leaf type and maturity of corn and your harvest date. If you want a lot of biomass, maybe an upright leaf type of corn and earlier harvest date is going to do better for you. But it's got to be a whole system approach. If you want to do that, you could maybe look at reducing herbicide costs or timing of herbicides or amount of herbicide or sprayer passes, or there's a lot of different ways you can work that in, but you need to be thinking about that the fall before. So with this trial, yep, a small stand of rye could still control weeds. You maybe don't need that 10,000 pounds of biomass like everybody kind of talks about. There wasn't a huge amount of biomass there, but it was even. But let's see. So this is the trial that maybe didn't work as well as we thought. This one's pushing the envelope. A friend of mine designed this trial, and his idea behind this was that he wanted living crops in the soil, or living roots in the soil, all year round. So to do that, we really needed to seed a cover crop somewhere in the middle of the summer in the soybeans. And his idea to do that was to let it self-seed. So somewhat like relay cropping, but we weren't harvesting the rye for seed. We were going to let that rye drop its seed and figure that was going to provide shade and regulate ground temperature. provide some biodiversity for other goals like wildlife habitat, things like that, and see how it all worked out. I want to preface this trial a little bit that this was 2020 and we were incredibly dry. So that rainfall chart at the bottom there shows that we were, 10%, 20% of our normal rainfall in June and July. Well, June was better, but July and August were very dry. So that may have hampered this trial somewhat, but it may have affected the results enough that I'm probably not going to try it again. So my treatments for this trial was killing the rye at emergence, killing the rye at the first trifoliate, and then killing the rye, never killing the rye, letting it go, letting it self-seed. So we aerially seeded this rye, had it flown on with a plane about Labor Day again. Let's see, there was my herbicide programs, I guess. So I used Prowl and Authority MTZ, so big on pre-program again. And I believe on this trial I didn't do any post-emerge herbicide just to see what the weed pressure was like at the end of it. It wasn't necessarily my goal for this to provide a lot of weed control. It was more on that idea of seeing what that rye would do if we never killed it. So it makes some really pretty strips. There's some pictures in magazines of this trial, but again, we used 40 ounces of Power Max. It was cold that when we were trying to kill it for some reason. We have used as little as, like John said, 22 ounces of name brand Power Max to kill rye. We haven't had a lot of issues killing rye unless it's like if it froze the night before when we're trying to kill rye in May, maybe not, but a lot of times we'll use either a quart or 40 ounces of Power Max. So that's just what beans look like coming up through rye and corn stalk residue. Again, this is a no-till system. Let's see, that's the self-seeded ones. You can see the heads coming through there. But rye biomass, obviously the self-seeded ones, including seed, we got up there even with a pretty thin stand that was dinged by some herbicide, and we drug the planter through it, and that kind of killed some of it. Got up there in that 8,000 pound, 9,000 pound range. So it did provide some pretty good biomass for weed control. But ultimately, self-seeded rye dinged our yields enough, and especially when our soybean prices climbed a lot last fall, that got to be a really expensive trial in leaving living roots in the soil all year. So you can see it reduced my early termination yield of 58 down to 45. I think a lot of that was due to the dry conditions. When we started out cover cropping, one of our main goals was pulling a lot of moisture out of the soil early in the spring so we could plant earlier. And that rye kind of made a highway that supported the planter and the tractor, and we didn't get mud on the tires and things like that. It just made a really nice field to plant in. But at the same time, that rye needs moisture to grow, and it grows really fast. So it sucked too much moisture out, I think. So with that reduction in yield, another thing that I didn't anticipate was self-seeded rye. And maybe because it was dry, that rye never fell down. It stayed standing. It stayed as tall as the beans all year. It headed out and made seed. So when I combined that, that's what my sample looked like. It was impossible to blow rye out of the beans. I mean, it's really hard to blow a bean out of the combine, but I actually adjusted the combine so I could get my fan speed up to 1,400 RPMs when it normally runs at 1150 or so, trying to blow more rye out, but that's what it looked like. The other guy that did this trial separated or cleaned every bushel of beans he grew and got 2 truckloads of rye out of it, but not something you want to do most years. So again, maybe I'm not going to try this trial again, but it provides some good data and some good thoughts on if you're going to try to relay crop something, is we push this system too far. But in the end, after harvest, that's what the strips looked like. So we accomplished that, leaving living roots in the soil 12 months out of the year, because we had that living rye planted in end of June, early July, when that rye matured and dropped some seed. So something to think about, kind of interesting results, but I wouldn't recommend most people push the envelope like that every year. Again, this was a decent sized trial. This was 1/4 mile strips by 16 different replications. So it was 60-foot strips. So it was a pretty good sized trial. But here's a trial that the results I think most people could learn from and probably adopt on their farm. Is just, like Jon said, letting that rye grow longer than most people would. A lot of the so-called experts in the last few years have said the least amount of risk in a cover crop is if you kill it the same day you plant it. Well, there's not a lot of reward in that either. So my idea of good cover cropping is letting that rye grow as long as possible, getting the most benefit out of it for my seed dollars and my time invested in it. So with this trial, I wanted to see how much biomass I could provide, how much weed suppression I could provide, and again, rely less on the herbicide, offset the cost of establishing the cover crop by reducing herbicide use. And with this trial, I wanted to plant early, didn't want to sacrifice planting date, and always I don't want to sacrifice yield. So with this trial, we drilled the rye. I don't normally drill rye, but I drilled this for the main reason we don't drill rye because I want to be in the combine. I want to be in the grain cart. I don't want to be in the drill early in the season. So this didn't get drilled until the 20th of October. That's fairly late in our part of the country, I think, if you want big biomass for weed control. Planted it with a cheap grain drill that I pretty much drug out of the fence row. Worked just fine. So I wanted to plant early. May 11th is not early for us. I planted soybeans on April 11th this year. So fairly early anyway, but a lot of university trials and things I see, they get good biomass, but then they don't get beans planted until the last day of May or the 10th of June or something like that. And that's not really real world in my situation. We want to get those beans planted. And a lot of times we'll plant beans before corn. This trial wasn't necessarily random replicated, but there's a balance between random replications and making a really confusing trial, or making a trial you can actually understand and keep track of. So this one was just A-B, on about a 10-acre field. But the replications here were at planting, and then ended up being 27 days after planting before I killed the second replication of rye, or the second termination date. So that's what that looks like. Virtually no biomass where I killed it at planting, and then that picture's taken in June. And that's better than knee-high rye, probably thigh-high rye on the left there. Again, heavy on pre's, Prowl, and Authority MTZ. And then just the termination. I didn't put any post-herbicide on this at all. There's the biomass. Again, virtually nothing at planting. And then 3 weeks after planting was 5,000 to 6,000 pounds. And there's the difference between the two strips there. Yes, on the right, there is some biomass there from the early termination, but definitely nothing like the left side. If you want to make your neighbors talk, leave a strip like this out in your field. They're kind of wonder what you're doing. And then not too long after that, those strips kind of flip-flop as that big rye dies. It turns bright white. It doesn't look like you have any beans there at all. That's later in the season. The beans have filled in, and you can't hardly see the beans in the rye. So ultimately, this field did have some weed pressure. It looks not great from the road, but I guarantee you I had neighbors that had bean fields that looked much worse than this with a lot more herbicide put on it. Most of what is out there is mare's tail. I controlled, and we've seen that a lot with rye. It controls or suppresses small-seeded broadleaves like water hemp. Doesn't do as good with giant ragweed. Doesn't do as good with mare's tail, even though mare's tail because it's a biannual, it doesn't do as good. Another thing we noticed on the right side there is the delayed termination. On the left side is the early termination. So I had much better weed control where I had delayed termination and more biomass. But that strip on the left would be ready to harvest right now, and the strip on the right, for some reason, kept it alive longer. So kind of some interesting things there. I combined the field on the same day. A week after this, it was all ready to go. But that was a pretty good reward for the work of doing the trial, was just obvious weed control difference between the two strips here. We've heard a lot about people that have big rye in fields getting leggy soybeans or lanky soybeans, or a lot of distance between the nodes. We didn't see that at all in this trial, even though you couldn't see those soybeans from the road for more than half the year. And you'd think it would compete for sunlight there. Next to a tape measure, pulled some plants there, and they aren't much different at all. But ultimately, what I wanted to see was I planted early and had really good yields again, over 60 on everything. And I don't know on the statistics of this, I'm not a statistician, but it was just every other strip. It wasn't random replicated. It's only 4 treatments. It's not a huge area, but it wasn't statistically different. Numerically, yes, the later termination beans did better, but I wouldn't count on that. I mean, that's not a goal of mine to make cover crops somehow increase the yield of beans, unless it's because I'm eliminating weed pressure. So with that trial, yeah, there's definitely potential to reduce herbicide use if you manage that rye for that purpose. A lot of people like to try a cover crop and don't really have a goal for it. I think do some planning, put it on paper a year ahead of time that I want to plant this cover crop for this purpose and manage that cover crop for that purpose. And it's really hard to measure success if you don't know what direction you're going. So again, didn't sacrifice yield, didn't sacrifice planting date, but I just want to capture more benefits from a bigger cover crop, from a more biomass, just getting more for my money, for that seed money. I would caution with some of these later terminations, you really need to work with your crop insurance agent and read the rules and make sure you understand them. But as of right now, and we're trying to change this with some of these trials, is late termination can make soybeans uninsurable if they think your yield loss is because of the cover crop somehow. We have a ton of data that says cover crops probably aren't going to hurt your yield enough to make a difference, but just have that on your radar. It's kind of tough to end a conversation on that note, but you just, yeah, understand the rules. If you want to bend the rules, want to do it on one field, that's great, but I don't think claim time is the time to tell your crop insurance agent that, hey, I did this practice that may or may not be approved. In my case, my crop insurance agent said, just get a letter from your district agronomist or something like that from Iowa State, and we did that. We pretty much got a waiver from NRCS and the state office of, of state office of NRCS, saying that we could do this on a trial basis, and he sent me a thank you card and a Christmas card in the end because he thought my results were really cool. So again, all of this is stuff through Practical Farmers of Iowa. All this data is available on the website. If you have other questions about these trials or any others, I'm all ears. Any questions specific to these trials, or want me to flip back to any slides about herbicides or anything like that? Otherwise, we can get Jon up here and talk. I think Margaret's got some loaded questions for us too.
I was just going to say, Sam, if you want to find your stuff, go to practicalfarmers.org, go to research results, and then just search under
This on
Bennett.
a trial basis.
And Sam's trials will come up.
He sent me a thank you card and a Christmas
And
card.
you'll probably find other trials that look more interesting before you get to mine. So.
If you search cover crops, you'll get a bunch of cover crop
Again,
trials. If
all
you
this
search
is
rye, you'll get a bunch of rye. So you
stuff
can
through
look at
Practical
it several
Farmers of
different
Iowa.
ways.
All this data
Great.
is available on the website.
Yeah, do you have questions for
If you have
Sam?
other questions about
And,
these trials or any
let's
others,
start there.
I'm all ears. Any questions specific to these trials, or want me to flip back to any slides about herbicides or anything like that? Otherwise, we can get Jon up here and talk. I think Margaret's got some
Did you
loaded questions for us
from
too.
year to year when you're
And,
putting this,
from each-
I think you're broadcasting the rye into the standing corn.
For the most part, yep.
Do you notice, depending on the amount of rainfall, how well it establishes?
It definitely depends on, it needs to rain afterwards. In our no-till system, I'm pretty sure our earthworms plant our rye seed, whether it rains or not. I think our earthworms go and find that rye. So that helps a lot. On dry years, we see almost all the rye growing out of the little earthworm middens, all their little trash piles. So that's a buffer against rainfall. I'm a firm believer in cover crops, and I want to do them every year before soybeans. But last fall, coming out of a dry year, it was very dry in the fall of 2020. I had seed in the shed to get all my cover crops seeded. It didn't rain. I talked to neighbors that said they had seeded, and their rye came up a few inches and wilted over and died because it ran out of moisture. And I didn't seed mine. I didn't plant any cover crops in the fall of 2020. So I guess knowing when to pull the trigger and when to not is maybe a tool to have. But I'm not sure what that would have done. We were dry again this spring, and I wouldn't want that cover crop to pull too much moisture away from the soybeans. But in all my research, I haven't seen it do that either. But I think moisture is probably second to harvest date as far as what the cover crop looks like in the fall. A lot of people kind of say that's a day in the spring is like a week in the fall, that you may have pretty slow growth in the fall. It may not look like much, but if you get warm, wet weather in the spring, it'll take off. So I wouldn't base too much on fall growth. But again, going back to that picture of timing of corn harvest, when it gets some sunlight in the fall, it really takes off. And I guarantee that was a spring picture. So that was a lot more biomass where I harvested early. So, does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Yep.
Sam, the studies that you showed us today, it looked like they were all pure rye stands.
They were.
Is that your normal practice? Are there any mixtures that you like to try as well?
I have done some. On the trial stuff, it's always been all rye. On my other acres, I've done rye and radish, turnips, different brassicas, kind of a cocktail mix. Mostly playing with those. Again, I don't know that I have a real goal for those mixes. I don't have livestock, so it's not a grazing thing. I would like to see more diversity, but for me right now, rye is really easy. And if I'm shooting for weed control, and I think that's one of the low-hanging fruits of cover cropping, is reducing herbicides with cover crop use. Before corn, I do oats and...
But, so real quickly, the Ag Water Quality Certification Program,
with the
as
oats
I said, it's
corn.
housed at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. I manage the program there.
That was the oats winter kill before corn.
It was established through a memorandum of understanding, actually,
I don't
with
see a
the US
huge amount of
Department
growth.
Agriculture.
After small grains, I've done a ton of really cool cocktail mixes, and you get those radishes that are, daikon radishes that are 2 feet long, things like that. You just don't have enough time in the fall after corn harvest.
Sam, have you ever flown those oats into your soybeans?
I've not flown oats into soybeans. I take that back. I have. just on a 40-acre piece, and they grew. I probably did them too early. They came up and they actually kind of wilted over because the soybeans hung on longer than I thought they might. It was a year kind of like this where you think for 2 weeks that soybean harvest is 2 weeks away, and then you think that for 2 more weeks, and then pretty soon you're a month behind, and yields were good that the soybeans hung on that long, but it was one of those years. So they need some sunlight once they come up. Rye does too. All right.
Gentlemen, I want to give you a chance. Would you each ask each other a question?
Oh. Yeah. So being a farmer researcher, what would be the biggest tip you would have to pull university research into larger on-farm practical research, either for better data or to help farmers understand what we're trying to accomplish or what to show? Have any advice that way?
So you're asking how to pull university research into farmers, or?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I look at university research and I think that's really specific and sophisticated, and I try to dumb it down on a large scale.
No, you're not dumbing it down. We learn a lot from farmers. Here's two items. One is if you're looking at small plot research compared to large scale research, what we ask you to look at more in our research is the relative differences between treatments, not absolute numbers. I can guarantee you that our soybean and variety trial performance data that you see published in books and on the web, those yields are probably a lot higher than what you're getting on a whole farm average, and they are. But we look at the relative differences, not the absolute numbers in that. And the second thing is, I go on plenty of farms, and a farmer asked me, "Hey, I wonder what will happen if I, X treatment? What if I put two times the rate of rye, or I cut this rye?" I always say, if you're a farmer, I encourage you to try different things every year. Try something on a small scale, though. Take some of our research that we've done, look at some of the treatments. Don't put it on your whole farm. Put it on a small plot on your farm and try it out. And I tell it to every farmer that comes to me and says, "Hey, what do you think will happen with this?" I said, "Try it on your farm and see." So we encourage you to try some of the things that we're doing on your farm. And Sam, I personally learned so much from working with farmers on our farm research and such, and so it's a two-way street. So.
Sounds good. Sometimes I think I'm a big researcher when I'm out there clipping rye with scissors from my quadrangle and taking biomass samples, or taking manual weed counts where I'm throwing my hula hoop out there and doing all the things. But then when it comes to statistical time, sure, after everything's done, I realize I have no clue most of the time.
Sure.
So, yep.
And so if I'd ask you a question, and I ask the farmers too, tell us what kind of research we should be doing. Give us some ideas of what are your challenges. What's your biggest challenge here that you would like to see done on a small scale? And the advantage of a small scale research is we can do a whole number of treatments. We can test 100 different soybean varieties in one test, and that's impossible to do on a farm scale. So what kind of research would you like to see in the future on cover crops?
I think taking cover crops one step further, I think there's a lot of potential in relay cropping, or maybe monoculture soybeans, monoculture corn isn't necessarily the future, and I think it could play into a lot of different things environmentally, not just economically, but I get a lot of questions about, do you solid seed two crops one on top of each other? Do you establish strips of a cover crop beforehand and then make that call in the spring whether you want to try to relay crop that? Things like that, and how to establish those, what the best row spacing or equipment to do some of those things are. I hear a lot of questions about that. I heard questions about that today from a couple guys. Didn't expect that, but yeah, some things like that. I think there's a lot of ideas out there. For me, growing small grains, I get to sell cover crop seed to my neighbors. I get to grow my own cover crop seed and know where that seed came from, that I'm not bringing in Palmer amaranth seed or something from somewhere that I may be exposed to that, buying cover crop seed somewhere else. I think there's a lot of bad cover crop seed out there. There's a lot of good cover crop seed out there. I like to know where mine came from, so those are some of my goals and how to make that pay. So small grain research in Iowa is not a thing. Practical Farmers is doing some, but as far as on a university scale, we're looking at Wisconsin, we're looking at Minnesota, we're looking at North Dakota, and trying to pull that back into Iowa. But I think relay cropping is probably the way I can make small grains pay on my farm. So I don't know, some thoughts on that, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
You've been talking about termination timings for soybeans, the rye for soybeans. Do you have any similar information as far as terminating rye for corn?
I don't have any data on that.
Okay. I don't have any trial data. For the most part, as early as you can. I think there's enough issues and enough people either don't have the tools, the time, or the ambition to manage rye really well ahead of corn. So for me, there's a lot of risk there. I could come up with other cover crops that I'd rather have ahead of corn, but planting corn green into rye unless you really want to be a student of that system, we could talk for an hour about the ways around that to make it work. And if having that rye living right up until the day you plant corn is your goal, more power to you. But
really, a lot of times, just your nitrogen management with rye, corn going into rye. Yeah, really, I think a lot of it is just the nitrogen, how you manage it. And even with the soybeans, you're talking about the day of killing your cover crop when you're planting soybeans. Well, now you are starting that process of breaking down that rye. Now you're using nitrogen right when that soybean plant is starting to grow. Mm-hmm. And soybeans do use a lot of nitrogen. Mm-hmm. They produce their own, but not early on. So that's something to think about. But it can be done. There can be, dramatic differences in yield if you just jump into it full bore. So definitely start on beans, learn from that for a couple of years, and then transition into corn if you want to try it. You don't have to. Oats is a great thing before corn or Nebraska's, but lots of things. Just got to work with plants.
I didn't turn in data for this, but it's this picture. These strips were established across the bean rows, completely perpendicular to the bean rows, that we thought with data there may be some other peculiarities with your planter or pass by pass, that something would have happened other years that might screw up that strip. And I've done trial work on this farm before, so we established these strips across the rows, and I planted corn into that. This was last year. I planted corn into that this year and thought I would see some difference in corn yield. Obviously, with how that was established, that we had living rye last fall. I didn't kill that rye until 2 weeks after planting the corn this year, but I went in and sprayed all of my 32% nitrogen over the top on those, actually on the whole trial area, and then I normally side dress all my nitrogen. So I don't know if just spraying some nitrogen over the top eliminated some of the issues with the rye, but again, I didn't kill it until 2 weeks later. And I thought I would see a checkerboard pattern of goofiness in my corn yield map this year, and I didn't see any difference across all of that. So I guess that's my only anecdotal story about planting corn into green rye. But most people, they're going to do one whole field of either planting green into rye or not strips like this. So this would be a pretty obvious spot if you're going to see a difference. But yeah, that's the story, is nitrogen early for the most part if you want to avoid issues with rye. I did have an organic field across the road that had really, really bad cutworm damage, and I scouted all my conventional cornfields or my GMO cornfields around it, thinking I may have cutworm damage in just glyphosate-tolerant corn, not treated corn. And I went out and I found some cutworm damage in this field and thought for sure it had to be where that living rye was. And then when I pulled my GPS pin up from what I pinned on my phone, it was actually not in a strip that was that living rye. So I wouldn't correlate that. I think that was just a random spot where some bugs landed and laid their eggs, and that was just in glyphosate-tolerant corn. It wasn't treated corn. So anecdotal stuff. That wasn't trial stuff at all. So, yep. All right.
Thank you guys very much.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.